the meeting is being recorded, as my Zoom just reminded me. And we are also making these recordings available with one of our new Dorn's Life literary magazines called Air Light. That being said, I need to tell you that you are being recorded, so turn your camera off if you don't want to appear in the video, like knowing that this will be linked to a magazine subsequently. And if you ask a question in the Q&A, we will officially ask for your permission to have your voice shared as part of the link we upload. So we won't do anything without your permission. The Levan Institute does have a newsletter that they circulate, and I will put the link to that in the chat. So for any of you who haven't signed up for that, it's a great thing, and you can click on the link or Isabella will post the link in the chat, and you can sign up to get more information about other events we're going to do, but also other events that the Levan does more broadly. And I think David might have already said this, but again, for the Q&A portion, we're going to use the raise your hand function, the little blue hand, and David or myself will keep a running list of the queue and David will moderate. Okay, David, would you like to say anything else?
Thanks, welcome. Thank you for coming. I'll just echo thanks to the Levan Institute for sponsoring this. I think, the first one was a really fascinating conversation, and I'm looking forward to a fascinating conversation today. Yeah, the only thing I would say, which I always say in class, so I'll say it here too, is we'll call on the little blue hands in order of how they are raised. So so don't feel like we're ignoring you if there are a few people in the queue ahead of you as we ask the questions. And I think that's it. I think we're ready to start. And so what I'm going to do is just quickly introduce the slate of panelists, and then they're going to present in sort of the order their names appear on the website. And then once those presentations are over, we'll move into the conversation and the question and answer. So the panelists are Leo Braudy of USC, Sarah Knott from the University of Indiana, Josh Kuhn, USC Annenberg, Amitava Kumar from Vassar College, and Karen Tongson from USC. I will just mention that Sarah is not yet here. We're going to start because of time constraints. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to weave her in, although the order may get shuffled a little bit depending on.
I'll send her an email right now if there's maybe.
Oh, here she is. Never mind. So we are good. So all right. So let's get started. And so Leo, why don't you kick us off? And then I'll just stick my head in after each presentation just to name the next person and kind of direct traffic a little bit. So Leo.
I wanted to start by just questioning the rubric here a little bit, which talks about the personalization of humanities discourse in recent years. But in my experience, it has a much longer history. And so I would just kind of take advantage of my seniority in the group without being too specific, graduating from college in 1963 and getting my doctorate in 1967. And really kind of growing up or whatever, being acculturated, let's say, in literary studies by a 1950s sense of the erasure of the personal voice in both literature and literary criticism. You might think about E.E. Cummings's lowercase spelling, including a lowercase I, or T.S. Eliot as the invisible poet there. And also about new criticism and the erasure of the poet's historical context, authorial intention, and even effort to move the reader. Just as an example, a paper I wrote in graduate school about Henry Fielding came back with a big red circle around the phrase Fielding feels, and the marginal comment was, "What's the matter? Can't the poor fellow think?" So thinking, in other words, thinking rather than feeling was what we were supposed to focus on. But I was a child of rock and roll and movies, and I emerged from graduate school in the heart of the politics of the 60s, the anti-war movement, and the civil rights movement. Clearly, detachment wasn't a viable option in the public sphere, so how could it work in the sphere of academic literary criticism? It might be useful at this point to make some distinction between the content and subject matter of feeling on the one hand and the style of feeling, the way any piece of writing is presented to the world. Looking back, this gave me a chance to kind of have this kind of meta look at my own career in a weird way. First articles I ever published, one was on Hitchcock's Psycho, and another was on the controversy between James Baldwin and Norman Mailer over Mailer's White Negro. But at the same time, I was turning my dissertation about the 18th century into a book. So, part of the question was, personal question certainly, was how many stylistic horses could one ride at the same time? Movies and popular culture, the affective, the role of feeling in history. I mean, it seems, again, having this overview sort of says, this is how I got to be this way. I don't know. Looking at topics that give feeling a history, like the history of fame, like the history of masculinity. And I guess I have to realize that the affective, the kind of response that I had to the movies, to rock and roll, I mean, this idea and to the politics of the outside world really led me also in an academic way back to the 18th century, the late 18th century, the age of sensibility and feeling. That is, one of the early times, certainly in the history of English literature, where people started talking about the way in which literature is supposed to move you. Is it supposed to make you cry? Is it supposed to make you sexually aroused? Is it supposed to give you some kind of political urge forward? Let's say, like, poems about slavery, for example. So, I mean, there's this kind of interweaving that I was feeling between what was happening outside academia and what was happening inside. The affective, I was thinking, let's say, another early thing that I wrote was about Samuel Johnson's preface to the dictionary. So, when you think of Samuel Johnson, certainly in those days, he was like this mountain of fortune cookies. You open up a little piece of Samuel Johnson, here was a saying, some kind of really abstract thing about the world. But if you looked at the preface to his dictionary, it's all about feeling. It's all about the people who have died, since he started writing the preface and things like that. So, part of it is, what is the intersection between a detached academic point of view, which was certainly the inheritance of the 50s, and an engaged, affective, emotional point of view. Other things that were happening at the time, again, the new journalism, the women's movement, the beginnings of Black studies, especially in new journalism too, the whole idea of reportorial immersion in subject matter. Again, not the detached journalist, but the journalist who is, who is somehow part of the material that the journalist is working on. I was thinking, let's say, about if you remember Hunter Thompson's book on the Hells Angels, where he gets stomped by the Hells Angels at the end of it there, or Tom Wolfe and Kesey's acid test, things like that. In my own career, also part of what happened was also going from Yale to Columbia there too. That is going from, again, the home of new criticism to a place where culture was considered to be much more a part of what you did as a literary critic. And again, that connection with the outside world. Lionel Trilling testifying in Lenny Bruce's obscenity trial. And even when I was there, we were constantly being tapped by lawyers to testify for sexual freedom in Denmark, or I'm Curious Yellow, or other kinds of early semi or pornographic films of the period. So it's an intellectual tradition there that emphasized culture in all its ambiguities, and therefore also, I think, the commerce between the academic and the non-academic world. And so it seems to me that the connection then, and this is part of the background of what's happening now, even more so, between literary criticism and the outside world isn't a contrast or a chasm, but a path. that goes in both directions, just as we can go in both directions ourselves. Another factor actually in that early period of the 60s and 70s was the first consideration of the history of professionalism, the meta understanding of the disciplines that we're in, that they have a history too, that in fact it's not just some kind of unidirectional search for truth, but in fact something that is conditioned, obviously by the background of the people working in it and the periods in which they worked. So when I think about these different forms of criticism, of writing, not just criticism, but writing in general, I think, anthologies, reviews, articles, books, talking in situations like this, somewhat between a classroom and a conversation. It's really, I have to say, the thing that comes most immediately to mind is trying to figure out what the audience is, trying to change somehow, or the audiences with their different interests and demands, to experiment with form, to experiment with voice there. The idea that every different project may require a different style, a different mode of presentation, and that what you want to glean from the project, what you want to find out in some basic way, is in fact, what is your connection to it, and how can you use your own self, in a sense, as a kind of dowsing rod of insight into what's going on. Now, of course, all of these urges are aspirational, and I only worry now that what in the past was a struggle is now just another trend, and that writers in academia in particular can choose the first person of feeling with as little actual self-reflection as those in the past chose to follow the detached third person of supposed definitive literary analysis. So, I mean, it's again a sense of personal awareness, a sense of audience, and a sense of of each project that you're involved in somehow requiring something different from yourself, perhaps, than the last project did. The end.
Thank you, Leo. That was wonderful. Our next presenter is Sarah Knott.
Great, thank you very much. And I do apologize for arriving only at 3:05. I can assure you there was much sweating on this end about the fact that my university's email system was down. But here I am. I missed the preamble, but I'm just delighted to be here and to think about the joy of writing in the context of a range of forms and styles. And I'm particularly appreciative to Emily for already having children walking through the background, because I come to this as a scholar who's written a book that was part memoir and part history of pregnancy and birth and the encounter with a small child. It's called Mother is a Verb, and I always appreciate when there's a good accessory in the audience making my point about maternal interruption. I'm already hearing from Leo's remarks that one of the vectors here is going to be generational and another vector will be disciplinary. And I thought, given the group, that it might be interesting for me to say a few words about the range of forms and styles from the position of someone who's a historian, and then from the position of the person that is the author of Mother is a Verb. Because it does seem to me actually that if we're going to ask about the different, the range of forms and styles in which we're writing right now, that it's very marked that historians have really taken to the airwaves since Black Lives Matter, and in particular since the 2016 presidential election, right? That there's been just a proliferation of commentary by historians in particular in journalistic venues such as the Washington Post's Made in History series, and that what we see there really is a variety of ways in which historians have sought either to make the past relevant to the present in some way, right? So I'm thinking of the kinds of op-ed pieces that point out that the genesis of the police force in this country is slave patrols, right? That kind of truth-telling from the past, or ways in which historians seek to make correctives to often assaults on the truth of the past, specifically by the right wing right now, right? I mean, think about the commentary that's happening in everyone's Twitter feed around originalism and its historical bankruptcy, right? The sort of novelty of originalism as a legal theory, or indeed the recent White House conference on American history, or their statement on Columbus Day. So there's a lot that's pushing historians, of course, right now to take to the airwaves in some kind of way of holding on to the activity of the past and a much more usable past, shall we say, for 2020. And I find that very exciting. I found it very exhilarating as a historian. And I think really there's a sort of supplemental quality to this, essentially, right? That what we're seeing is historians bringing knowledge that journalists don't possess. And instead of being interviewed by journalists, they're actually writing the short pieces themselves. It often has quite a democratic effect, right? And I think often these pieces are written by graduate students as much as they are by sort of senior figures in the profession. That seems salutary. And I think that's in particular in combination with Twitter. So I think the forms by which editors and historians find each other have proliferated. I think there's a shifted voice of authority there in consequence that might have interesting effects on more canonical forms of historical writing. But always I think the emphasis in those kind of journalistic pieces is about the relevance of the past to the present, right? So the emphasis is on prescience, it's on precision, and it's in being well informed, right? It's largely free from historiography. It's empirical, it's informative, it's corrective. And to the extent that these kinds of pieces are stylish, to use part of the rubric for today, I think that's largely a byproduct of the form, right? That some of the historians who are taken to the airways in that way are invested in their style. I think of my colleague Rebecca Spang writing about the revolutionary moment for the Atlantic. I mean, one of the most stylish historians in her writing that we have, I think. But I think it's incidental. I think the stylishness of those pieces is largely incidental to their form. So that's where, if one had to make big sweeping generalizations, as I just did about history and the range of forms in here in 2020, I think that's where one would start. But the kind of commentary that I've made doesn't fit in that op-ed mode at all. You know, the kind of history that I published last year is quite at the opposite end of the spectrum. At first glance, it's sort of domestic and mundane. But I'm thinking here then of a more minority strand of historical writing then that does pick up the other baton that's handed out in the rubric for today, which is sort of fiction, memoir, personal essay. And unlike Leo, I have no sense of a sort of robust canon of scholarship that might precede me that dwells in the personal voice. So I'm a historian of sensibility, so I absolutely have a sense that we have a historiography of the emotions, but that for me is a very different thing from a historiography that puts forward the first person voice as a form, as the historian's voice. And so when I set out to do this rather peculiar side project on pregnancy and birth and the encounter with an infant, it was largely reactive. I thought this was the privilege of tenure. This was a response to sort of catastrophic effects of sleeplessness. It was a response to the sense that there was no intelligent conversation about maternity in the American public sphere, and there most certainly wasn't one which could keep up with the ways in which maternity and gender are fracturing in the here and now, right? There wasn't any history that responded to the fact of trans men, the fact of gay couples with small children, the fact of more egalitarian working practices among dual income parents, for example, right? And so I just wanted to write the book that I needed in that moment. And whilst I'm a historian, I had come of age at that historicist moment in which often what historians and literary critics did looked almost the same. So I was someone who had a sort of very biographical pleasure in the intersection of literary studies and historical studies, and felt very delighted by traveling with literary critics and very formed by being a member of the Centre for Century Studies here at Indiana University, right? So I counted as my compatriots people who like to think about literary matters, and I liked to look like them. And part of what appealed to me so immensely when Emily got in touch with me was the sense that even if we've lost that historicist moment, I think we've lost that shared historicist moment, this may be another moment in which the disciplines of history and literary studies come together again, because they are both preoccupied with form, and they have to be in the context of the proliferation of forms and new kinds of economic pressures on humanity. So it was very appealing to me to think about this. When I think about mother as a verb, I think probably the most useful thing for me to foreground in the context of our conversation is how much flowed from, in ways that are unexpected to me, how much flowed from the decision to write in a first person voice. And that was the clumsy way in which I described it at the beginning. It was the pitch I had made to my editors that I would blend memoir and history. I even had a very pragmatic conversation with my British editor at Penguin, where she said, you know, no more than a tenth should be in, no more than a tenth, Sarah, should be in the memoir form. whoa, okay, that wasn't at all how I imagined. I thought I was unfolding an interpretation, but that's how it started out, in a slightly bog standard way of talking about memoir and history and using the two. And of course, what happens on the page is very different. And the language I found for describing it that was most useful was actually given to me by a Los Angeles writer, Maggie Nelson, when she was out at the South Bank in London last year, where she got sort of pulled into this actually quite tedious conversation about form and was she an auto theorist, and she sort of sighed and winced and said, well, I just think of it as presencing, being present in your own text. And she made this comment just so flatly, like with no affect. And it was as if it just took all the sort of heat in the room away in a very good way. And I thought, yes, thank you. Now we can talk about this in terms that don't just force us into talking about genre. They actually let us just talk about voice and what happens when an author puts themselves in the text. So I'm sort of a fan of the notion of presencing, and I intend to use it in all occasions possible. And what I found in presencing was that almost all the usual conventional protocols for me as a historian just fell away the moment I began in the first person, right? So if we think about the most conventional of historians' conventions, those would be seeking to tell change over time, telling narrative, writing in the third person, right, with that distanced voice, right? So historians are really, really good at identifying overarching chronologies. They're really good at offering convincing narratives. They're really good at adopting a clear distance from the investigation. And all of that left for me when I began using this mode of presencing, always with the aim of pluralizing and specifying past experiences, and always with the aim of making what I could with what was extraordinarily fragmentary record of pregnancy, birth, and the encounter with an infant, right? And so what I found in presencing, and especially through the kind of anecdotal writing that presencing encourages, was that it allowed me to put on a level playing field the kinds of sources that normally would be very difficult to put in relation with one another, right? That the anecdotalism allowed me to put a shard from a slave narrative or from an indigenous oral history next on the same playing field as, an interrupted letter by an elite white woman. And so it had all of these salutary effects related to presencing and anecdote that I wasn't expecting. And then when I start to pause over that, when I went back to the book today, actually from the completely different vantage of the pandemic and being, returned to scenes of maternity under duress, frankly, I was struck by several other things. One was the extent to which I was borrowing from a radical tradition of writing about maternity, right? Audre Lorde, Adrienne Rich, which was marvelously apparent to me. I mean, I was saturated in that writing, and I was borrowing from that tradition, the poem and the essay, and from that tradition, dominated by lesbians, dominated by women of color. So it was saturated in that for me, but in ways that did not turn up in a thoroughgoing way in the footnotes. So I thought there was an interesting point to be made there about citational practices and the infrastructures of text. I came to think that part of the value of presencing for me as an interpreter was actually the ways in which it extends a kind of radical form of empathy between a writer and their audience, and between the past and the present. So it let me think about those kinds of issues quite self-consciously. And that mattered a great deal for a topic that is, on the one hand, incredibly sentimentalized and moralized, right? Especially when we're thinking about white women's maternity. And on the other hand, the object of utter condescension or accusations of mundanity or worries about universalism. So it let me do some interesting things with empathy that I don't think I could have done otherwise. I also thought the presencing let me kind of step in and around the gap between the past and the present. So I could sort of point it out, and I could push at how we know or why we might care in ways that felt very fluid, in ways I would not have been able to do in a third person voice. And lastly, I want to suggest that actually, for all of the obvious problems about navel gazing or centering certain kinds of voices that might go with presencing done badly, one of my big takeaways is that I think presencing is a remarkably generous form of communication, right? That presencing is very rarely about displaying how much more clever you are than your reader, which is what we're trained to do in graduate school. And presencing is often about figuring out how to bring the reader along too. And that was a revelation to me. And I really only learned that in talking about the book in a public and having having people I would not have expected to identify with this topic come up to me and say, oh, yeah, this is mine too now, and tell me stuff. But clearly what had happened was that the presence voice was inclusive enough to allow a reader to feel a shared empathy, even across very significant boundaries of identity and experience. Right? And of course, if you think about it, because that's what history does, that's what the narrator of this book does at every turn, is to bring forward experiences that are not her own. And so it would make sense that a reader would similarly respond to the writer that way, and feel that they could fellow travel with experiences not their own. So I find the term presencing really useful in a conversation like this. And I have two last points I'm going to slide under before I pass the baton now. When I think about publics and when I think about the range of writing in the present moment, because it does seem as if we are in a moment of expansiveness and opportunity, and a moment that's exciting. And so I wanted to make two other kinds of points. One was that I would love to have a conversation that's about audience, and specifically about publics, because I have found, both in my conversations with colleagues who are skeptical about writing for wider audiences, as well as with editors who are concerned to create big audiences, is that we have a very, very attenuated language for the publics that we address. You know, we don't call scholars a scholarly public when we might do, and we don't recognize the sort of general reader, which is, at least in the general reader is themselves a bit of a construct and not the same thing as everybody out there, right? And so there's a sort of weird morality that gets attached to addressing wider readerships, in place of actually having a really precise vocabulary about what are the publics that we think we are wanting to address, and how do we work back from that address to the writing that we do. And I would love to see us name our publics, not least in order to valorize scholarly publics and academic monographs and academic journal articles, which I'm very interested in protecting, at least as much as I am in enabling us to speak to a wide variety of audiences. So one point about naming publics, and the other point, and this is the last one, is that I think there are all sorts of opportunities that we haven't yet explored, that scholars haven't yet explored, in terms of how we make visible academic communities when we do our presencing, right? So in other words, I'll put this in a very short way, we could write historiography differently through presencing if we had more than single authors on our pages. And I think there are opportunities to think about how we stage scholarly community for communities beyond ourselves at this moment of the crisis of the humanities. I think there are opportunities there that we might want to explore together that I think could be very exciting. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Josh, you're next in the lineup.
All right, thank you. Thanks for having me here. I guess I'll try to just go through a few kind of scattered thoughts, and hopefully they line up together. I guess when thinking about the range of writing for me, no matter what that range looks like, I think for me, writing always has a deep foundation in a kind of fear and insecurity. I don't care what the platform is that I try to write in, no matter what kind of piece I'm writing, whether it's a piece of journalism or a scholarly article or a scholarly book or a more public book or whatever it is. The experience always, and has always felt like this since as early as I can remember, going back to high school when I first started writing as a music journalist, is basically being buried alive, as uplifting as that is. And I feel when I'm in the middle of a piece, I'm always feeling that sense of suffocation, and feeling that desire to crawl my way out. And once I'm finished with the piece, that sent like a full physical sense of relief. Like I'm a radically different person when a piece is turned in than I am when I'm writing it. I'm very unpleasant to be around most of the time, but especially while writing, you don't want to be around me. I'm not fully present, to Sarah's point and Maggie's point. So that's, I think, an important thing I just want to put out. So far, everybody's been talking about writing with such confidence and security, which really threw me for a loop. So I could, in a way, stop there because it's kind of everything. But I'll just kind of name a few other quick things. One is this question of publics and audiences. When I was in graduate school, teaching and writing academically and learning how to write academically, I was also working actively as a music journalist as a way of paying my way through grad school. And so I was writing as a music journalist for magazines, but also writing a weekly column in the San Francisco Bay Guardian that I wrote 800 words. I had to write 800 words every single week. And so I had led this kind of double life as a writer, where academic writing was always taught to me as being long form, and looking forward to a kind of, it's okay if it takes a year or 2 years or 3 years or 4 or 10 years to finish a book. Whereas in the world of journalism, of course, it's no, there was a deadline, and I had 800 words to tackle some really, really big concept or a new album or a new book, connect a number of threads and dots. And what it trained me to do was be comfortable with the fact that when I would hit send and a piece would come out, that everyone knew it was going to have errors. Everyone knew it was going to be incomplete, because who could cover everything in 800 words in the course of 1 week? Whereas the pressure, at least that I felt in doing book writing, and particularly in academic projects, is this daunting pressure of being exhaustive and getting it all right. And that prevented me, in fact, from my first book, having tremendous writer's block, after being a working professional writer for many, many years, that I couldn't write the book because the book felt like there were different expectations and all those kinds of things. So it was a good experience for me to understand the role that writing in the popular press, as we used to call it, it was always like a rehearsal for other kinds of writing. And I'm really have been grateful to have those opportunities to rehearse ideas with less, what has always felt like less pressure to me. So the next thing I'd mention quickly is which is something that's already come up, is questions of kind of form / style and content. It's something I think about constantly and worry about and teach about, particularly to my doctoral students. I tend to find most doctoral students are not actually have spent their lives and their careers writing, but have never thought of themselves as writers, have never thought about what writing means. They've never thought about voice or style or arc or character. That's a big generalization, but I'd say the majority of the students I've taught over 25 years, it's for me to say that, you are writing, think about your writing as writing. It's always a kind of shock. And then backing up of, I don't know how to write, I'm an academic, I'm not a writer. And so bridging that gap, trying to think about those questions of voice and character, and really, and it's something I hold myself to and struggle with constantly, is what is the story I'm trying to tell? Not my argument that I'm proving, but what's the story that I'm trying to tell? And how am I going to tell that story? The third point would be, this is probably related to the fear part, and the insecurity part is kind of mystery and imagination. I find that part of what I dislike the most about so much of the scholarly writing that I do and that others do is the lack of mystery, the lack of the unknown. We're trained, and we train others to, start our pieces with, this is what I am going to tell you, this is how I'm going to prove it, and by the end you will know X, Y, and Z. And that I increasingly, the older I get, find that it's just so unsatisfying. Just intellectually and emotionally, and in terms of the pursuit of knowledge. So I miss that sense of mystery and of starting a piece. I know Amitava will probably mention this because it's something that's in his most recent book on writing, is that kind of idea of you start and you don't know what comes next as a writer. And that is usually talked about maybe more with fiction writers than with nonfiction writers, and certainly more with academics. But I think that's a lesson that nonfiction writers and academic writers need, is just starting to write, not knowing, sentence by sentence, what's coming next. So that's something I'm wrestling with right now. Fourth thing is range of writing requires a range of reading. And I just, I'm in the middle of a book right now, and I'm just reading like crazy across very, very different kinds of writing. Probably the one that I want to just emphasize here for the sake of the conversation is I read a ton of poetry. I'm very jealous of poets, very envious of the economy of expression, the ability to kind of hold a microscope on a detail and have that microscope open up into a universe within the turn of one line. That to me is so moving and so powerful. And it's something that I really strive for in my own work. Last thing, really quick. In about around 2000, I was very fortunate to be part of a now defunct program called the Arts Writers Program that the Sundance Institute had. And the Sundance Institute invited arts writers in non-mainstream publications. I was writing, as I said, for the San Francisco Bay Guardian at the time, to come to the Sundance Labs in Utah during the summer and to sit with the composers at the Composers Lab, the playwrights at the Playwrights Lab, et cetera. And their reason for this at first kind of offended me in a way, because they said, if you're going to be an arts writer, you really need to understand the arts better. And so I kind of went kind of kicking and screaming, but I found that they were right. I found that that I myself, at least, had actually spent little time learning from the kinds of people I was writing about. And it totally changed my life and changed the way I do my work, where I sat with a musician and actually watched how musicians made decisions about what they played. And that changed the way I wrote about what they were playing. Or I watched a theater director, Michael Mayer, they were workshopping Spring Awakening and watching, an entire cast assemble at 9 a.m. in the morning to start a rehearsal. They get 5 minutes into the piece and it's clear to everyone in the room it's terrible. And they stop. And he says, everyone go back to your rooms. I need the day to figure this out. And he wasn't crying. He wasn't upset. He wasn't packing his bags to go home, which is what I would have done. He was living with failure as part of the creative process. And that really changed just the way I approach writing, and not trying to be perfect all the time. And the last piece of that is I met Zelda Fichandler, who the former head of the dramatic arts at Tisch at that institute. And I asked, she's a legend in the theater world. And I kind of asked her with my notebook and pen out, and I said, if you could recommend 5 books for anyone writing about the arts to read, what would they be? She looked at me almost like she was going to tap me on the head. And she said, I don't recommend any more books. I have a feeling you've read all you need to read. You need to take an acting class or a body movement class. All writers need to know their bodies better. And she was right. And I think that it's changed also the way I think about my body on the page and what that kind of putting one's body on the line, and not being detached in the way that Leo said, both in terms of the personal, but being engaged physically, and understanding the embodiment of our writing. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Josh. That was really fascinating. The idea of the body on the page, I think, is something I'll be thinking about for a while. All right, Amitava, you are next in the lineup.
All right. Well, it's great to be here. Josh said that he would address his fear and insecurity. I'm here to express rage. I'm here to talk about anger, by which I simply mean that I thought I would speak a little bit about my remarks. I would speak about style by talking a little bit about a book I published earlier this year called Every Day I Write the Book. And when I talk about anger, what I mean is a certain disaffection or dissatisfaction with our academic modes of writing and what we do. And I just wanted to share my self-consciousness that I sound sometimes like, a bitter spouse leaving a bad marriage or something. But that's how it actually happened, this book, because I had written a piece 10, 12 years ago. An editor said to different scholars, could you write your academic credo? And I wrote one called Declarations of Independence. And it says, in effect, something like, post-colonial theory doesn't have an audience. It is writing without people in it. which was my sense that it often spoke from the safety of a seminar room without engaging actual lives, the complexity of lived realities. And so I wrote that piece, and then the editor at Duke said, well, why don't you write a book about it, something. And so that's what the book came out of, the idea that we could look at folks who were doing a bit more interesting work, who engaged audiences across different disciplines and also across institutional lines. And so I thought I would talk to, Josh, in fact, was one of them. I would speak to folks whose books I liked. And then I would talk to folks who are writer friends and ask them, is there one book of academic writing that you learned from? And what was it that taught you something? Even if you hated the book, what is it that taught you and has helped you in your life? Because, like in huge Indian joint families, every English department I've been a part of has always been split. The creative writers are on one side and the literary theorists or critics are on the other. It's like, the Mahabharata between the Pandavas and the Kauravas fighting an endless war. And I thought the blurring of the lines between these two families, meeting somewhere and discussing some examples of books that were doing something to blur the lines would be the best thing to do. So those were the two impulses. But I also had a fear. The fear was that if you, maybe all of you have better friends than me, but I certainly, and among my friends, would always, whenever we met, we would talk about how little we were writing. That was a part of it. It's a part of an academic existence to say, oh, I wish I was, oh my God, summer is now over. I thought I would have my book done this time, And that was also an impulse for this book, because there is a line of Annie Dillard's, which I hope to find in a second. It said something like, how we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. And I write here, those words scared the living daylights out of me. I thought of the days passing, days filled with my wanting to write, but not actually writing. I had wasted years. And the desire to formulate for myself a certain rule of writing, how much to do. I tell my students here where I teach that you have to do 150 words every day and 10 minutes of mindful walking. And I, just sticking to that simple rule, also started work and, with my students, wrote books. So the desire to formulate for oneself certain rules to write, and thereby to also give permission to oneself that when the flight attendant comes walking down the aisle and gives you that customs form and you have to fill what your profession is, you don't necessarily write professor, but write writer. And allowing those rules to function as guides, and allowing yourself to find models, these people who actually do blur the lines between disciplines and forms. This has been the design of this book, and this is what I have done. Now, Sarah mentioned, for example, Maggie Nelson, and she's one of the examples here in this book. And also Claudia Rankin, who maybe David was responsible for it. She got an LA Times Book Award, but the award that I was interested in was, I think it was in the National Book Critics Circle. Her book, Citizen, was nominated both for the Poetry Prize and for Criticism Prize. And I always think that should be, hashtag goals for us to be, to not only write books that are prize winning, but actually more modestly, what I want to suggest is books that people do not know which category to put in, And I think once we are driven by that idea, then particularly as academics, we'll have escaped the disciplinary boundaries that have been built around our work, and different other kinds of boundaries. Just this morning, although I never taught a book of mine in my classes, just this morning I had to go up leave the student on Zoom and go up to look for this book because there was a line that I wanted to tell her about. I said, first, these words from the writer and editor, William Maxwell. After 40 years, what I came to care about most was not style, but the breath of life. So in any discussion on style, I always want to remember this, and always while sitting in a committee or something, I want to say, where's the breath of life? You know, what are we, and use that to guide our writing so that I understand the idea that this sense of the reader, that ideal sense, is a highly imaginary and constructed sense. But for me, the more immediate point is how to think, I mean, where is the heat on the page? And where is this writing, and how well is it in any way inciting in my heart or in my mind this sense of life, something palpable or tangible. Couple of other comments. One thing, you know, often when we are told that we are academics, the assumption always is, certainly when you're going up for tenure, that you have got a certain command, certain authority. Josh was talking a little bit about it. And there's this lovely quote that I've put in the book. Is from Grace Paley, whom I worship. And Grace Paley says at some place, you know, in an article called "The Value of Not Understanding Everything," she distinguishes criticism from literature with this disarming lucidity. She says, what I'm saying is that in areas in which you're very smart, you might try writing history or criticism, and then you can know and tell how all the mystery of America flows out from under Huck Finn's raft. Where you're kind of dumb, write a story or novel, depending on the depth and breadth of your dumbness. And I'm very interested in that. And I think of that as a part of how we must promote, or we should promote, the idea of writing, which is not just of authority, but that of exploring one's limited understanding of the world and oneself. And there again, we are getting to a little bit what my younger brother Josh was talking about, mystery and imagination. Talking about mystery and imagination, have you heard the joke, Josh, which is that if an academic were writing a detective novel, they would say, and here's a book in which I'm going to prove that the butler did it, you know? Yeah. The other thing about dumbness, which if you will allow me, I want to quickly read a quote from Philip Roth, is, this was in American Pastoral. He says, the fact remains that getting people right is not what living is all about anyway. It's getting them wrong that is living. Getting them wrong and wrong and wrong, and then on careful reconsideration, getting them wrong again. That's how we know we are alive, we are wrong. I mean, I know it won't necessarily get you tenure if you wave the banner of your wrongness, but I think determinedly pursuing that idea of revising our intentions and of suggesting the limits of our knowledge, and then still going on to stumble on to something that seems like knowledge and seems helpful. And even if it doesn't, it seems to be alive with something that is worrisome or moving or a path out of some impasse, would be a good way to go. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I love that Roth quote, and I agree entirely. Wrongness is the key to my entire aesthetic. So I feel like I should have that quote tattooed on inside my eyelid. So thank you for sharing that. Karen, it is your turn.
So I think we're going to move from fear and anger to the question of survival, and also the question of entitlement. On survival, I want to begin with, really my touchstones for writing across styles and genres happen to be the great queer women of color who were writing in the 70s and the 80s. And of course, Audre Lorde's line about poetry is not a luxury. The quality of light by which we scrutinize our lives has direct bearing upon the product which we live and upon the changes which we hope to bring about through those lives. And I think that, what we receive from that work, from queer women of color feminism from the 70s, is the urgency and confluence of politics, the personal, and also the poetic, right? And that was a kind of inspiration for me. It made me want to aspire to be able to write in those ways. That said, I want to speak very clearly about the material conditions of writing and who feels entitled to be a writer or who feels like they can claim that mantle. And my own story is one where, I'm not going to start from graduate school or college because I went to community college first. And the very first literary magazine that I was a part of was at Riverside Community College. And, the fact of being in the Inland Empire with a scrappy bunch of writers, people who were creative and wanted to write but didn't know how or didn't have the tools and didn't have the kind of sense of how to go about it or the material conditions to afford to do it. It was important for me to experience and to understand and to know. And, not having been networked into any other writerly circles at that point or at that time, or even understanding how anything like publishing worked or how academia worked or how any of these things worked, I saw school as the pathway to becoming a writer. And some of you out there may have the same story. Some of you out there may be in graduate school or have gone to graduate school because you're trying to find pathways to publication in ways that you wouldn't otherwise understand or know. And I think obviously I was moved by a lot of different things, and it was also like the genealogy that Leo was talking about in the beginning. I had tremendous teachers. I did a lot of reading, and in many ways, my pathway to wanting to be a writer, wanting to be a poet, came in a very cliche manner from admiring the florid lines of Percy Bysshe Shelley when I was in high school. Right. And so the combination of that with, all of the Smith's Wildean references and references to Keats and Yeats, create a kind of interesting genealogy for where the writer comes from. The writer doesn't always come from a dignified place or a place that, seems, I don't know, predestined to a certain kind of greatness or to framing certain stories, having, been predetermined to share certain stories that already come from a special place. You have to make of these details something special. So that's maybe like a tip on style to those out there who are still trying to sort out, well, how do I even pitch a story? How would I even begin to pitch a story to a newspaper? How do I publish, an article here or there? Honestly, it was a big learning curve for me into and through graduate school. I applied to go to an English PhD program because I liked to write and I enjoyed reading. And I thought I could always teach and support myself while I wrote. And I happened to get into a good graduate school and they trained me how to be a good scholar or how to be a scholar who was competitive on an academic job market. But I was always pulled between those two desires from the very beginning. And even in my earliest writing, I wrote a dissertation on Victorian nonfiction prose. I couldn't help but break face. My chapter on Pater has a reference to the kind of Platonic storyline of Hedwig and the Angry Inch. My article on Thomas More's Irish Melodies quotes Entertainment Weekly, along with these archival materials that I dug up in the British Library, right? And so when we're talking about range, I think we also have to think about how we, as writerly subjects, understand the objects that inform what we write. So that's one of the things that I definitely wanted to bring into the mix because, it's not just, D.A. Miller once said that in a course I took in graduate school that, it's very showy when people move between the popular or the crass or the base reference and the highfalutin reference or the kind of effete reference. We were talking a lot about style, obviously, in that seminar, and he thought it was showy and braggy, but sometimes that's the toolkit that you got, right? Sometimes those are the frames of reference that you have. So I do want to kind of, honor that and think about how actually some wonderful writing came out of that, especially in thinking about how the everyday was transformed in those queer women of color texts from the 70s and onward, and in some of the queer of color criticism that you will find has always also challenged the kind of tonalities that academia has demanded of us for tenure, promotion, and these other things. And in fact, it is a constant struggle for certain disciplines, certain books, the way they're written, the more experimental they are, the more theoretically experimental they are, even to be taken seriously in the way that we've structured academic evaluation. But yeah, I mean, I think that said, one of the things we can do for those of us who teach graduate students or students is, and those of us who have experience publishing, is to create occasions and opportunities for them to learn how to do those things that we had to kind of sniff out ourselves, like learn how to pitch an article, learn how to, I always have my graduate students submit an assignment where they plan to pitch to an online publication, whether or not it's attached to an academic journal or to something else like LARB or, public books or something like that that's para-academic. Anyway, I do hope that we consider the kind of the true democratization of not only who gets to write, but understanding writing as something that comes from many different places and that can be routed through different pathways. And sometimes, it's going to take a while to get that byline in the New Yorker or what have you. But, hopefully there will be those of us along the way who help you to figure out how to get there and work your way to that place. And it's upon us as critical teachers of criticism, to do that as well for our students. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for those really thought-provoking statements. I got a lot of notes, and I'm hoping all of you in the audience do as well. We're going to open it up to sort of audience Q&A. So as we talked about at the beginning, please hit the little blue hand at the bottom of the participant queue if you want to raise your hand. And I'll call on you. And if you're directing the question at one specific panelist, please do that. If it's a general jump ball kind of question, that's also totally fine. Just let us know what you have in mind. So any questions? Just like class, a little slow to get started. Well, let me start let me start with one quick question. And this is for Karen. I was really struck by that notion of it being showy to drop in like pop culture references or a song lyric or something like that. Because when I was an undergraduate, I was actually told exactly the opposite, that it actually kind of, it lowballed my criticism, or it lowballed my academic writing. It made it pedestrian because I was arguing for, I don't know, for like a rock and roll lyric. I was treating a rock and roll lyric as if it was poetry, which is exactly was my intent. So I wonder if we can I ask you, can you go a little deeper on that, on that whole notion of kind of the blurring of, I hate to even use the high low, but the sort of the so-called high culture, mass culture divide, which I don't believe is a real divide anyway, but.
Well, I think we should consider the source of that statement, and that was D.A. Miller. Mm-hmm. And he was writing about, he was talking about the secret of style, and he himself, I think, takes pride in being showy and showing that range of from the high to the low. But I think that, why he suggested it was showy in that context is that, in his mind, like style is nonchalance. It's not trying, right? So the capacity to drop proliferate references from a range of different sources is indicative of a kind of effortlessness, right? Mm-hmm. That in and of itself, that effortlessness is showy and stylish, right? So there are a lot of different layers to that idea, but I do think that increasingly, I think that breaking the fourth wall, as I used to call it back in those moments, it felt weird to me to be doing it in the context I was doing it in. My dissertation director was Catherine Gallagher, so she was not like super keen on my Spice Girls and Adorno Horkheimer references at the time. They had to make sense, right? Like I had to make sure that like I wasn't just doing that just to drop the reference in, but because it made a certain kind of sense and to understand what that kind of longer connection or tie was. So I don't know. I think that increasingly though, it's you know, we are expected to have a breadth of cultural literacy as critics, as writers, and you know, we're expected to be able to use those things with, you know, a certain kind of panache. But I feel like you know, it's a fine line between whether or not like people will bristle at that in an evaluative context or not. And luckily, I think that in our department, in the English department at USC, I think there's enough people writing from enough different places that it's really created a home for me to be able to do the kind of work that I do.
I think that's, yeah, I think that's true of the department as well. Nathan Pearl Rosenthal, you have your hand up. Do you want to unmute? And
Thank you. Yes, I'm unmuting, but not turning my video on. Sorry, I'm not in a place where video is really feasible, and this computer is too old to do virtual backgrounds. So I just wanted to say thank you first to all of these panelists. I thought these presentations were just dazzling. And that actually is the sort of the kernel of my question, which is, you've spoken so much about different forms of presence, different, genres, different ways of writing. And I was wondering, as I was listening to these magnificent oral presentations, if you would say something about the relationship between, to put it in jargony terms, textuality and orality. How does the sort of the oral or the spoken figure into your writing practice? Some of you touched on that a little bit, but I just wanted to toss that out. And I was curious to know how the various ways in which you speak, whether with colleagues or formally or in other ways, might play into that, into those kinds of writing practice, the variety of writing practices that you are engaging in. Thanks.
thank you. All right, I guess I'll call that a jump ball question. So does anyone want to take it?
I mean, I'll take it partly from a position of innocence, which is that I hadn't actually thought about orality very much until after my book was published. And then I went and talked in many, many different venues and found myself reading it aloud. And that experience of reading it aloud to an audience as opposed to reading it aloud at home hugely shaped, or will shape, better put, how I will write in the future. I can't now imagine writing a paragraph that I wouldn't read aloud to an audience. And that's a completely different premise than any previous writing that I had done. And I suppose, in fact, to link back to what I was saying about presencing, that also shifts what kind of presence one might imagine one is conjuring there on the page. So thank you.
I would say also, I think, and somebody mentioned this in one of the presentations too. I think, you know, the orality also of empathy and maybe it was Sarah, I can't remember, but when you talk, I mean, there's a book, the book is different. Your book is different, or your ideas are different, let's say, when you're sitting there with the computer and writing them on the page and finishing them up. And then when you have to present them to other people, and all of a sudden it turns out that the other people latch on to what you've written in a very different way than perhaps, or not different, at least the way that you couldn't have foreseen. And that kind of orality is really connected to your relationship to the audience that's right in front of you. You know, people would once say, you know, say, what for a man to write a book is like a woman to have a baby, one of those stupid analogies. But I think for anybody to write a book is not like having a baby, it's like having a teenager, you know, because then they just walk away from you and have friends that you've never met and, you know, might disapprove of and things like that. But as your book gets a different aspect for you too. And I think, you know, there's almost a kind of dialectic, I feel, with that, you know, then the next book, you know, you start thinking about those kinds of issues in a different way than you did before.
My favorite analogy, since we had been talking about Dillard a little bit earlier, is, you know, Annie Dillard in The Writing Life says writing a book is like sitting up with a sick friend. that has been my experience more than any other. Josh, you had your hand up for this to answer this as well.
I was just going to try to answer that question. First of all, in Amitava's book, which I hope everyone who's on this in this meeting does read if you're interested in these questions, because it really is just a brilliant and delightful kind of exploration, not even a manual, but an exploration of these themes that is just great. And there is a moment in it where one of the pieces of writing advice is to always read your writing out loud. And I think for me recently, I've been, for the book I'm writing right now, I've been trying to actually perform pieces before they're published. So I'm trying to take things that I'm writing for the page and before they're on the page fully, whenever opportunities I have in a lecture or in a more kind of musical or performative context, to actually perform it out loud with musicians in some cases, to challenge the way I'm reading, to challenge the way that that I'm starting to write. But I wanted to share one thing that I just realized about 2 weeks ago, under the influence of what's legal in California, which was that from most people who know me don't know this, but I have a stutter that I've learned to hide over the course of my life very, very well in my speech. And so, but what I realized the other night was that it's impacted the way that I write. And I had never thought of this before, and I never realized it, but there's certain tics in my writing and certain patterns, usually of kind of endless phrases and endless commas, constant riffs on the same idea, where I'm almost developing my own pattern and my own rhythm and my own momentum as I'm writing. And that momentum helps me move through speech blocks. And so there are certain letters and words that you will rarely see in my writing because I can't say them out loud. There's certain repetitions of consonants that are harder for me to say, so I don't use them. And I never actually realized it, but I'm sharing this with all of you strangers, mostly in the hopes that if there are limits and roadblocks that you have in your own speech, and in the way that you process information, in kind of embracing those, not running from them, but embracing them to develop your voice and to develop your own style, I think is really, really important.
Nothing will make you feel weirder about listening to, or about, I mean, you know, having to narrate an audiobook or your own book will make you feel really shitty about how long your sentences are. I'll just leave it there. And it makes you like, I was like, I can't believe I wrote another Jamesian length sentence. I hate myself. Anyway, I'll stop there.
I wonder how many of you write to music? I mean, that if you were talking about the body on the page, you know, I think computer writing is so detaching, you know, and that you need to have some kind of physical feeling when you're writing, to me. And, you know, writing by hand gave you that physical feeling. Typing does not give you that physical feeling.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I think there are certain things that I write by hand and certain things I write on the computer, and it varies sometimes depending on the work, or things that I'll write at a desk, or things that I'll write sitting like in an armchair, you know, at a laptop or a desktop. I do think that the kind of your interaction with the tools can have an effect. Jonathan Liao, you have a question.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much to all of you. This was totally brilliant. I'm so excited that you're sharing everything with us. I have a quick question that hopefully connects this recent really beautiful piece in Airlight by Emily, No Room of One's Own, with what Josh and Leo were mentioning just now about the body on the page, as well as Sarah's remarks about presencing. I'm curious to know what your writing practices have looked and felt and sounded like during the pandemic, during a period in which embodiment and sociality and breathing itself have all become very differently marked.
All right, who wants to take that?
I'll take that. I'll throw in something. You know, I thought because the news was so endless that, you know, I certainly found myself taking in oxygen, you know, news as if it was oxygen, that one needed to just slow down, calm down that breathing in of the news. So I thought how to slow jam the news, you know, in a way different from what Jimmy Fallon was talking about. There's my high-low reference, by the way. You know, Gandhi started in South Africa, the printing press, because he thought you have to produce a newspaper that allows people to learn, but it should not be a feature of industrialization. You have to slow it down. So one of the things I started doing and putting it in the public sphere in a way back was on Insta or Twitter was take the news, the obituary from the New York Times, and then try to slowly paint things over it and then write that day's. So the coronavirus diary became taking up the news and slowly altering it in some way, just trying to make people look at it differently. So that was how I was dealing with it, in trying to both record it but alter it. So record the news and alter it aesthetically.
I have a schedule for writing that I've tried to keep. I'm a very obsessive and compulsive. I'll just put that out there. And so the method that I've always used and jokingly called the Tongson method is like, I, start writing. I only write for up to 2 to 3 hours a day, between 11 to 3 or 11 to 2 or thereabouts. And so I can wake up and do something else beforehand, have a real breakfast, mess around online if that's what I want to do. But I have to sit down for those hours every day. That becomes more and more difficult with administrative responsibilities and duties, and in the context of the pandemic with sheer and abject terror at all times. But what I found has helped is to winnow that window of time to 1 hour and to place it at the most fecund period of your day, and to just do it, to just set and do it. And it always, the stuff always gets itself done, even if I write one sentence and work on the same sentence one day, or write several pages the next day. Just the sheer repetition of it, Monday through Friday, treat it like a job. I've tried to keep up with that, but again, it's been winnowed to like 1 hour or less than an hour often, because I always let myself stop if I get really exhausted. So.
This reminds me of a conversation we had in the first session where we talked a little bit about this, and where even if you could get 30 minutes or 10 minutes or something, just to kind of keep a bit of just some sense of continuity. And I found that to be really, really, really great advice, because I'm one of these writers who I've always looked, I say, oh, if I only have 30 minutes, I'm not going to do it, because it's like, I'll just get started and then I'll have to go do something else and it'll be frustrating. So I'll wait till tomorrow. And that whole notion, what you're talking about, Karen, has completely changed my way of thinking about grabbing whatever few minutes you've got.
I would think also, I always have to fool myself too. It's almost like the opposite of what you're saying, David. I have to say, okay, I'm just going to sit down for 2 minutes and do this. And that's all right. And then the 2 minutes turn into a half an hour or whatever it does. But, it's sort of like, we were talking about anger and all these other emotions. There's shame too. What kind of idiot are you? You can't sit down for 2 minutes and write, really?
Yes, the voices in our head. Margaret Rosenthal, you have your hand up.
Hi, everyone. This has just been an absolutely wonderful panel. It's one of the most inspiring hours and a half that I've had for months. So thank you so much to the organizers and those of you who spoke. One of the things that, so much of what has been said has impacted me, but I'd like to pick up on something that Josh said that really struck a chord, and this notion of fear. And then what Leo was just saying about sort of tricking yourself into doing something, as both things have really been a part of the way I write, is to edge in and just sort of try and not have a plan and trick myself and say, okay, it's just going to be a few minutes. But the question I wanted to ask had to do with this notion of fear. And in my own life, I've dealt a lot with writer's block and fear. And so it really explained a lot to me for you to talk about it. But the way I've dealt with it is to write in collaboration with another person, almost in my whole academic career, except for the first book I did. And that feeling of not being alone and to be talking to somebody, it was not only a strong feminist ideological desire that I would write with another woman, but also that it kept me from that fear of perfection and that fear of, can I do this? Yes, we can do it. We can do it. We can do it together. If it's a dialogue, if we work together, if we ask each other questions, if we, a lot of what we were doing was a translation. We did translation work, so we, needed to be in close proximity. But it's that feeling of collaboration, of feeling that academia is a community, whereas so often we're left with feeling that we're isolated and alone and divorced from the world that we really love, which is going into the classroom and sharing ideas and being with people. And so for me, it's when my writing partner approached retirement and said, Tita, my nickname, she said, I don't think I can write another book together. I'm gonna go off and finish up this book I'm working on. I felt as just absolutely crushed. I mean, what was I going to do? And it's taken me literally years to get back on my feet. And I bring it up for the students who might be in the room to think about, because this notion of collaboration, and how long is it going to take for academia to applaud the notion of scholars coming together and writing together and knowing that that is a strong impetus and motivation. So I'm wondering if any of the writers who spoke today have felt ever the need to do that, but maybe didn't do it because academia was saying, no, you've got to write this on your own, and that's part of your, this is the imprimatur of the intellectual in the humanities.
What about that question? Has anyone on the panel participated in collaborative work or thought about participating in collaborative work, as well as sort of thinking about the resistance of the humanities to collaboration?
The only time I've done collaborative work is actually collaborating on anthologies with somebody else. And it's not quite what Tita is talking about, since you usually just parcel out aspects of it and don't really work necessarily together, except in the conceptualizing of it.
There's also I find the editor-writer relationship to be, or when it's working well, to be quite collaborative. I wonder if anyone can talk a little bit about that experience. Amitava, you had talked about your editor looking at, coming back to you and saying, why don't you write this book? Can you talk a little bit about we tend to think of the book as that the book has to be generated internally. There's some kind of organic connection, but I'm curious about, taking an idea from or following a prompt, let's say.
In academia, actually, the editorial role, unfortunately, is a very limited one. It's a very narrow one, is that of an acquisitions editor. If, let's say, someone at Cornell University Press is interested in having Karen write a book on women writers of color, they will get in touch, and then the proposal will be sent to people who can assess it. The idea of the editor doing collaboration himself or herself is very minimal. In fact, that is a weakness, I think, of academic culture. Out in the quote unquote real world, the editor is involved in changing your work, and that becomes much more collaborative. In the spirit of what you were asking earlier, I think it would be wonderful to have the sense of, we are promoting. My college, for example, promotes interdisciplinary teaching. They want you to, so there'll be a note from the dean saying, please, that annual letter that comes saying, please think about collaborating with other professors to teach in, that thing doesn't happen, certainly with writing or publication. But it would be great, in the spirit of what you're proposing, it would be great for folks to encourage actively and suggest. I think that's a wonderful thought that you've had.
I want to disagree a little bit, because I think in the outside world, it doesn't happen that often. I think the publishing has totally collapsed in terms of the attention that, that is mainstream publishing, not academic publishing, has also totally collapsed in the relationship of editors to writers. It's so rare that the acquisitions editor becomes the line editor. That is just, an incredible rarity. And you usually, there's somebody that you don't even know who's doing the line editing most of the time. It's this very, very sad thing what's happened with publishing over the years, both academic and commercial publishing. So much of the burden has been put on the writer, compared to the past, where the publisher would do so much more for you. Everybody has to do their own permissions for pictures and quotations and things like that now. I think it's a very sad situation.
Karen, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to say I've collaborated on a couple of articles with people, but more often than not, those collaborative pieces are not in strictly academic journals, but again, in these kind of para-academic contexts and often for something online. Not because I don't want to collaborate on something longer and, more serious, but because I think that it's really difficult to coordinate schedules. Obviously, there are two collaborators actually. One postdoctoral scholar who's also postdoc in gender studies has collaborated several times over with the same writer, Joan Lubin, Jean Vaccaro and Joan Lubin, and they published.
It looks like Karen is frozen. So let's keep moving because we're close on time. And then if she becomes unfrozen, we can bring her back in. Josh, you had your hand up. Did you want to comment?
I was just going to continue on the thread. Why don't we move on? It's okay. All good, just to get one more question in.
Yeah, let's get one more question in. So there's a question in the chat from Claire O'Connor regarding the politics of public writing and political writing. Have you, and this is for everyone too, have you ever felt that you were, as Corey Robin has characterized the task of the public intellectual, having to create a public for your writing? How have you navigated that challenge? I'm particularly interested in how best to translate theory for the political left. Does anyone have a thought on that question?
I can speak to the dilemma of addressing two different national audiences. When I wrote Mother is a Verb, I was writing it for Penguin in London and Farrar, Straus and Giroux in New York. And that meant navigating not just two different editors, but two quite different publishing cultures, but also two really different national audiences. And in some ways, I ducked the bullet. What I didn't do in that book, and what I would try and figure out next time, is how to thematize that. In some ways. And the reason that I didn't was going to be a grumpy immigrant, right? That was the voice I could not find in that book, was the voice of the person that was in disbelief that she lived somewhere without a national health service, right? And with escalating maternal mortality, especially for Black and lower thought women. And it was, and I couldn't find that grumpy immigrant voice. And I have to say 2020 is not helping me out on that one. It's not the easiest time to be a British born American historian who never subscribed to the national mythology, left or right, in the first place. I'm finding it very silent. I'm self-silenced, by which I mean that it's very difficult to figure out what the voice is of a white British immigrant in 2020. So my own sense when we think about public, that's why I made the point about publics, is that I actually think we do all of ourselves a favor if we construct an academic public as valuable, but that we also name what those alternate publics are that we're addressing. Sometimes there are students, and that's really come up in this meeting, I think, because we're aware that we're a mixed group ourselves. But when we address general audiences, we're always addressing subsets of audiences, and we're often addressing audiences across borders. And I think it helps editors and readers to have some ways in which that is brought into a text. I did that largely generously in my book by foregrounding a certain kind of biography that I knew could be legible across national boundaries, and by having, having 20 years of experience and being a binational person that shapeshifts and trying to thread the needle that way. But I do think a self-conscious, a deliberate way of thinking about pub serves the book really well. Not a paralyzing one, but one that's deliberate, I think, serves the book very well, or serves an article very well.
Yeah, I think that I agree. If anyone else wants to jump in, if not, we will go to one last question, which is Daniela had a question. So Daniela, do you want to ask your question?
Oh, wow, this is brave. There's 1 minute left. It actually segues perfectly on what Sarah was saying, because first of all, thank you. I found that wonderful and really helpful. And a couple of things that connected for me was Josh's point of, that an important part of finding different ways of writing or different voices is to look outside of the voice that is not working and to, try out different things. And, I often feel that I know people who became professors because they like to know a lot, and people who became professors because they like to learn a lot, but I have never met a person who became a professor because they loved reading academic books. That I have never heard as what drove people. But one of the things that surprised me a bit was just how Anglo-American the conversation was in this imagination of who an academic writer is and what they sound like as this sort of boring, fuddy-duddy, apolitical, impersonal person or writer, because there's many places where being a professor and being a writer means also writing for different audiences in different places with different voices, with very personal voices. And so I just wanted I know that many of you work in transnational, transcultural contexts, and I just wanted to bring that here because that's another place to look. If you read academics or serious monographs, whether they are academic or not, that are published in other places, there's very different voices, and that can be incredibly, just open up options for thinking about what your own voice as a writer could be.
I think that's an excellent point, and worth our considering. Does anyone want to comment on that? We are really right at the edge of time, but but if we could stay for a minute or two if anyone has a thought. If not, what I wanted
to say one quick thing, David. This maybe isn't the global or kind of answer that you're looking for, Daniela, but I just, for the sake of all those on the meeting, if people haven't read Saidiya Hartman's latest book, to me that is an incredible prompting and an incredible example of how to merge so many of these conversations around doing historical work, archival work, theoretical work, scholarship with fiction, and blending those together. When I read that, I just was so in awe and so jealous of the skill in that book that I can't wait to teach it. I can't wait to share it with my own students. But I just wanted to throw it out there as I think a really good example, Daniela, of someone who is deeply rooted in the academy, and also deeply rooted in the importance and the politics of using speculation and fiction to amend and heal historical injustices.
Yeah, and can I just jump on that as well? Because I'm teaching a class called Archival Silences, Histories of Gender next semester, and I was partly tempted to just slow read Hartman for 16 weeks. Because it absolutely does what Amitava asks us to think with, right? Which are the books that do that? And historians are claiming that book, even though she emerges out of literary criticism. But to me, what's wonderful about Wayward Lives is to pair it with Lose Your Mother, her earlier work, where she's writing as a literary critic. And that book is all about presencing. And so Hartman has given us presencing, and she's given us critical fabulation. And those books read next to one another in incredibly provocative ways as well. So I'm going to pair Wayward Lives with the earlier Lose Your Mother, which is about the transatlantic slave.
Thank you, Sarah. All right, so we are out of time. I want to first thank everyone for coming and for sticking around. This is a really excellent conversation. As I said, I've got notes. I'm totally inspired. I'm really enjoying these once a month Wednesday afternoons. So let me first thank. Let me also thank the panelists: Leo Braudy, Sarah Knott, Josh Kuhn, Amitava Kumar, and Karen Tongson for their big brains and good thinking and participation. And I also want to let everybody know about the third event in the series, which will be on Wednesday, November 4th, 12 p.m. to 1:30 p.m., the day after the election. The Shape of Writing, Thinking Like an Editor, which will be more of a traditional panel discussion with Sewell Chan, the editorial page editor of the Los Angeles Times, Deborah Friedel from the London Review of Books, Kim Robinson, who's the editorial director at University of California Press, and Tracy Sherrod, who's the editor of Amistad, the HarperCollins imprint. That'll be November 4th at 12 noon. Thanks to Levan, Daniela, everyone for coming, and I hope you all have a safe and lovely rest of your week. Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.